Right. Well, welcome HGSE alumni, current students, and friends to our faculty fireside chat. I'm Lisa Himmelman, the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement, and we're very delighted to have all of you joining us today. So before we get started, I just have some light housekeeping items I'd like to go over. So as you can see, we're hosting today's session in a meeting style, so feel free to keep your camera on or turn it off, whichever is your preference. We will be recording today's session. As you can see, I hit the record button and distributing it to all of you and to everyone who registered in a follow-up email next week. You'll notice that you're currently muted, and we do ask that you remain muted when you're not speaking. This is meant to be an interactive session, though, so everyone here will have the opportunity towards the end of the session to raise your hands and go off of mute to ask questions and have discussion. We also invite you to use the chat for asking questions, and we will be moderating that. And I just want to note that please, when you're asking your questions, whether you're audibly doing so or in the chat, to please try to keep them short and succinct. And that way we make sure that everyone who wants to has the opportunity to ask their questions as well. We have closed captioning available for today's session. So if you'd like to see those captions, please click on the CC/live transcript button, then click on show subtitle. You can turn off subtitles by clicking on live transcript, then click on hide subtitle. And finally, we'd love to get a sense of who's here today. So if you could please put into the chat your HGSE degree, your program or concentration, and where you're joining us from. And now I am delighted to introduce our featured speakers today, Dr. Pamela Mason, HGSE Senior Lecturer on Education, Dr. Kim Parker, Director of the Crimson Summer Academy at Harvard, and and Liz Phipps-Soeiro, who is the Director of the Boston Public Libraries. So Pamela, I am going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for joining us for this fireside chat. And at this point in the time of year, it is a nice time to have a fireside. Our topic is There's No Place Like Home, talking with children and youth about books. So we're going to try to keep this around being not so much academic, but like how do we engage learners in wanting to learn how to read and also enjoying the whole process of reading. So Kim and Liz and I have a kind of an arc of learning. So Kim's going to start us out talking about like what is the universe of books that are available and adding some nuance to that area of books. And Liz is going to talk to us about how to find books, where to find books. And then I'm going to talk about some more how to talk about dialogic instruction and just talking to your children and the youth in your lives about books. So Kim, will you kick us off, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Parker. Just as a point of context, I am the director of the Crimson Summer Academy at Harvard. But before that, I was an English teacher in Boston, Cambridge, and Newton, and have worked sort of across the board with kids who have interesting reading lives, but have reading lives that have not necessarily been accepted in traditional school spaces. So that's like how I enter the space. And I just wanted to frame that. I believe that all children are deserving of robust literacy lives and experiences, and that we as grownups often get in the way. So as Dr. Mason said, I'm going to try to frame this a little bit, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. But I do want to sort of start with this quote from Jason Reynolds, who is a fantastic children's and young adult writer. He's a Black man. And he says, I know I exist in the world, therefore I should exist on the page. And so that's what I always try to remember, that we are here, we have always been here, and that's what we should normalize, right? And so I want to think about that there have always been texts representing diverse and inclusive experiences. They've been here. And a key example of that is W.E.B. Du Bois's The Brownies book. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it was published in 1919 with the express mission to be an affirming space for children of the sun, as he called it. And he said that some of the goals were to make Black children familiar with the history and achievements of the Negro race, and to make them know that other colored children have grown into beautiful, useful, and famous persons, right? This was in 1919. This is the Brownies book. Also, right, it's available in the Library of Congress. All of the issues, which is wonderful, right? You can call them up and still share them with children. I think those are relevant. Also about the Brownies book is that really prominent literary figures, including Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Langston Hughes, first was published in the Brownies book, right? So think about sort of what does that mean for Black children when they are being exposed to this robust literacy and literature from a young age. So that's in 1919, right? We want to sort of be ahistoric in some conditions, but let us all remember that diverse and inclusive texts and the people writing them have always been here. Also, I'll just talk about a couple of resources, like publishing houses exist that publish inclusively diverse text. Some of them include Just Us Books, which has been around for a really long time. Lee and Low Books, which also publishes trade and school books. And then a book or a press that I love, it's a micro press. It's called Flamingo Rampant out of Canada. They publish LGBTQ, queer text, other diverse texts. They are amazing. Not a lot of people know about them. And they are a strong press. I guess they're a micro press, but that's one of the big, I think, challenges is that we often say, like, where are the books? Do they exist? Assume the books exist, right? Assume that we are here. It's a challenge to actually find them, but actually it's not so much of a challenge. Also, websites dedicated to representation that do it right. I mean, I think that it's really important to think about, if you're reading these texts, who is in charge of getting the media or the information out to us? I do believe in own voices, right? So if we're reading Indigenous texts, for example, Dr. Debbie Reese, American Indians and Children's Literature is one of the most important, if not the most important person to get us, to help us to understand what books we should be reading and which ones we shouldn't, right? Like if Dr. Reese says, don't read it, I don't read it. I've listened to her, I believe her. Also, she says to always assume we have Indigenous children in our classrooms, right? And so think about them as well. There are always, we need diverse books. It's great because it covers a range of inclusively diverse text. The ALA awards are getting more and more diverse. This is a big year, I think, for them. Also to think about, like, oh, these are the books. And I bring these awards and places up because, again, we often will say, like, I don't know where to find them. But the landscape, while still limited, has lots of opportunities for us. And then there's this group of young people out of Florida. They're called Children of the Glades. They're Seminole kids who have a fantastic reading life. Like, they make suggestions, they are critical, they help us to lead the way. Like, really, I do believe that young people are going to save us. And so, like, listen to them. And so a couple of other things, like in terms of access, it's important that we are supporting the places that actually get us the text. In Boston, Frugal Bookstore in Nubian Square is a Black-owned bookstore. They have a fantastic children's and young adult section. So if you're looking for, like, what's new in Black children's books, go to Frugal. And also, it's really important that we support publishers and places that sell inclusively diverse text, because those books are often on a short run, so they're not out for very long, right? So if we want to actually make sure that there's access to these books, then we need to actually support the people who have the books. And then before I turn it over to the rest of this wonderful panel and we get into discussion, a couple of things to remember also is that when we're looking at text, we have to have a broad definition of text. It's not just the physical book we have in our hand, but also it's digital, it's photos, it's videos, it's all of these texts that we can use to define reading and literacy, and also that are available to kids. Again, adults get in kids' way, right? We want to be gatekeepers about what they can read and how they can read. And what that means, though, is that we limit access, right? And so lots of inclusively diverse books are in these formats, right? But if we're saying you can't read them, or I don't like that, or my own biases are coming into play, then we are ultimately limiting the reading lives of kids. And so then the question is like, well, we have access, right? And access really isn't enough. And I can't wait to hear Dr. Mason talk about like, what do we do with the books? It's not enough to have them on our shelves. It's not enough to say, I have a classroom library of all of these diverse texts. If we're not diverse, right? If we're not really actively seeking our own liberation and equity and using books as a way to get there, then it's all a sham, frankly. Like, it's just not going to work. And then we have to think about like, what are the stories our texts are telling, honestly, right? Like, if I've been in classrooms where all the books are trauma narratives, right? Like, it's really hard. Like, the stories, like, it's really hard to be Black. Well, this is what I like to say. 99.9% of us Black folks are living everyday lives. I'm serious. Like, I go to the store, I like take my kid to where he needs to go. Like, we're just living everyday lives, everyday stories. So really, like 99.9% of the books on our shelves should be like those everyday stories. But if we're just telling particular, like the enslavement stories, particularly during Black History Month, it's the month now that we're all like dreading because this is when the stories come out, then that's a problem, right? So how can we really think about the diverse stories, right? Like, we have so many stories to tell. And if we are only telling the same stories, and if kids are only digesting the same stories, then what does that tell them about themselves? And what is our responsibility? And why are we accountable? And how are we going to change it? Because again, right, Jason Reynolds, I know I exist in the world, therefore I should exist on the page. And so what is our responsibility to make sure that we are providing access, beyond access, but incorporation, appreciation, affirmation of text in ways that really enrich the lives of children and let them see that they can have all of these possibilities that literature and literacy provide them. I'll turn it over to Dr. Mason.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm taking notes. There's so many things that I want to say and respond, but then we have Liz, and I know I'm going to have a lot to say and respond to her. So Liz, take us out.
Thank you so much. And I apologize because I am going to be a little academic. I am not a doctor yet. I am a PhD student. And so that's where my brain is right now. And I'm going to and also I'm a visual person. It's really important to me to have slides just to make sure I'm on track here. So here we go. Firstly, I want to respond a little bit to Kim. I know we're going to be in conversation, but Dr. Parker, you said something that I feel like is really important before I start my journey with you all today, which is assume that the books exist because they do. They do exist. And thank you for naming some of those incredible publishing houses. They are out there. And what I am going to do today is contextualize that in like the historic and political and social history of children's literature in schools and in libraries. And this is my first slide. You can actually see there are people here today that are in this slide, including Dr. Mason and Dr. Parker, who are always on this slide, actually, and a wonderful professor who I know is here today, Dr. Patricia Kruger-Henney. You know, I like to acknowledge the folks that inspire my thinking because nothing comes to me in a vacuum, and I too seek out diverse voices, experiences, knowledge, and narratives, and that's incredibly important, especially because I am a white woman. I've lived in New England my whole life. I've taught in urban spaces in New England, mainly in Massachusetts, my whole life. So it's really important to inform myself of other ways to be and live and know. So thank you to all these wonderful people. So a prompt that was given to me for today was to think about why school libraries and public libraries are important, and then what roles do librarians play in giving kids access to books that interest them. And it's really important, I think, to situate the conversation in a social, political, and historical context to understand how school libraries and public libraries as institutions were actually created to control particular narratives. And suppress what narratives and stories and texts and books kids have access to. So, a lot of times in the media and within my own profession, libraries are presented as these repositories that are neutral, that are a haven for information and literature seekers, and that the librarians are like this passive figure that collects the books. And we think about that as access, but that's not access. And there is no such thing as neutrality in our educational institutions, including libraries. And I also think that school libraries and librarians have an incredibly important role in disrupting the systems of reproducing dominant cultural norms and values through critical literacy and sharpening the critical lenses of all the folks we work with in schools. So that's students and families and educators. And school libraries are critical, reflective, joyful, generative, collaborative, and wonderful places. And as I know that I'm talking to current educators, future educators, leaders, school leaders, I would be loath. Not to mention that many students, particularly students in urban and rural communities, do not have access to school libraries. And we need these spaces, and we need our community to champion school libraries because they're an essential part of students' educational landscapes, especially in the current political climate. And so schools and libraries have historically contributed, like I said, to reproducing these dominant cultural norms and white supremacy culture. And when I say white supremacy culture, I'm using D'Angelo's definition, which is a social, political, and I would add colonial and economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit people that are perceived as white. And this system is built on the historical and current accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group so that any person or group who is outside of the dominant culture is othered and marginalized. And so when thinking about the access to stories and books and texts and narratives that our students generally have access to, so just like Kim said, the books are there, but what do we generally give our kids access to? It's important to keep this in mind. So white supremacy culture shapes the larger information landscape that our kids exist and operate in our schools. So dominant cultural norms and values dictate what stories are deemed valuable by our institution. And so then how does that affect what texts we as educators have access to and provide to kids, and which stories hold power and value? And this can actually be measured by what texts are available and accessible to students. And of course, I'm sure many of us know Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, and we evoke her metaphor books as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors often when we talk about inclusivity and diversity in books. And that those mirror books provide an opportunity for self-affirmation and multiple possibilities of beings for the children who read them. And we know that these mirror books are far more accessible to children with particular identities, namely identities that I share in, white, cis, hetero identities. Beyond this, the people creating and curating these books for children share in those identities I share in as well, which is why it feels of particular importance to understand the institutions that are creating and making accessible children's books and stories at large. So very quickly, this survey was created by the children's book publishing company that Dr. Parker just spoke to, Lee and Low, which is a great small publisher, and St. Catherine University from 2019. And it shows how overwhelmingly white the publishing industry is. And so it begs us to ask, how does this show up in the books we have available for our classrooms? And how do the racial and social identity of folks in the publishing industry dictate which books are published and mass marketed? And how do those identities determine what books to give a star review toward and recommend and end up in our journals like School Library Journal and all these other places where we're looking for recommendations, right? So there's that piece. And then if we look at, this is from the National Center of Education and Statistics. This shows us too, in the percentage of teachers and students and their racial and ethnic identities. And so teachers and librarians are very similar racially to this too. Who is recommending the books? And this makes me think about our teacher and librarian training programs. Are we being taught to think about our own social and racial identities? And how does this impact our work? Are we asked to think about the kids we are working with and how it affects what books and materials that we're choosing to bring into our classrooms and libraries? And then this is a slide from the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And I think people are probably pretty used to seeing there's an image of kids looking at mirrors, and it looks at the publishing statistics of books that feature particular characters with racial identities versus like animal books, right? And we've seen that a lot, but this actually shows us that these are books that are feature BIPOC characters predominantly, and it shows us that 71% of the books that are written about a BIPOC character are written by a white person. Also important to consider. So what happens when we give kids access to information and stories that deviate from hegemonic norms? Well, and this is where my dear friend, Dr. Kim Parker, who I hope talks to this point, Disrupt Text, that's Kim co-founded that movement, but right, so lots of great things happen when we can disrupt the dominant narrative, right? So there are incredible organizations and peoples who are disrupting the status quo. However, for institutions that are really invested in perpetuating these norms, we see a backlash, and that's where we are right now politically. And we know what books that are being banned are books that fall outside of this cis het white identity, right? So the majority of the books being banned are books that talk about racial identities, gender, sexual identity, orientation, and intersections therein, right? So this is a concerted effort, again, to marginalize particular narratives. But there is no despair here, right? So what's amazing and powerful is that with this information, we can use the historical, social, and political context to sharpen our own critical lenses and to become better educators and center children's experiences, knowledge, and stories that they bring with them to our schools and libraries. And that being critical is not cynical. Cynicism closes doors and narrows our understanding of the world. It feels very desperate, and criticality invites hope and joy, like Dr. Parker was talking about. New ideas and considerations. It creates space, more space for ourselves and others, and is empowering. And so I'll stop after this, but how to do that. So these are questions I created to ask myself what am I doing as a school librarian who, historically have benefited from and been, I've seen myself in books growing up all of the time that were very readily available in the curriculum and for pleasure on library shelves. So when I go into a classroom or a library, I want to consider what that means because not everybody has that privilege. And so these are some of the questions, and I won't read them out loud, that I created to ask myself around those texts that I'm choosing to share with children. And thank you.
Thank
And
you
so
so much, Liz. That's very helpful to just kind of set the context of what's going on in libraries, and especially pointing out that libraries are not necessarily neutral spaces. So I'm going to now talk about how we can help students, as Frary said, read the world through books. And so they are reading the world through books that represent them, to represent other people, represent other places. And it's part of kind of rebuilding that criticality that Liz talked about. And also what Kim was talking about is that we have always been here, and we will always continue to be here. And so I want to kind of take this, kind of in a conversational way as like, what do we do? I mean, there's this with books and our youth, children and youth in our lives. We don't want to make reading always arduous and a task. There is, everyone is like literacy loss and literacy crisis and yada, yada, yada. And, if you were like, you don't want to be doing push-ups every day, all day, and then go home and do more push-ups. And so we want to bring joy, and we want our learners to want to learn how to read. And so part of that is having fun with language. Books are language that are in text, either digital text or printed text. It's language, it's storytelling. And how are we telling those stories? And how can we engage in conversation about those stories? Reading aloud. Children can be read to even after they learn how to read. I was put in my place by my firstborn when I informed her when she was in second grade, you can learn, you know how to read now. I don't have to read aloud to you anymore. And she looked at me and said, if children didn't need to be read aloud to, they wouldn't have mothers. I said, okay, wait, where's the book? Give me the book. And really, it was like, yes, this is part of our bonding. And I think when you think about, even if you have children in your lives who are considered by some struggling readers, we all enjoy a good story. Why are podcasts so important to our lives? Why are everything that we digital books, we enjoy hearing stories, whether they be stories that we just tell about our days and stories that are in print. So that they really, reading aloud really is an important way of bringing these narratives, these stories into the home. And then as you're reading, if you have the need to ask questions, I know, we're all like high energy and high expectations, then let's ask some questions that you would ask a friend. I mean, if you're talking to a friend about a book, you're not going to say, what are you going to put in your diorama? You're going to say, well, what do you like about the book? What are the characters like? Is there a character that you like in particular? Is there a character that you would want to have as a friend? Is there a character in this book that is like one of your friends? And so kind of making that personal connection with story is really important. And rather than, okay, we're going to find the main idea and we're going to find 3 facts, and then we're going to, like, okay, leave that at school. That there needs to be this opportunity to really enjoy the language and enjoy the story structure. And there's also a lot to say. You can read aloud informational text. Sometimes we always think that, read alouds have to be long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Most kids want to know why the stem goes up and why the roots go down. I mean, quite frankly. And so reading informational texts and then using those informational texts either before an internet search or after an internet search to kind of get into the ways of, how is knowledge organized? What are ordinate, subordinate categories? Lots of literacy going on here just through a conversation. I'm terrible at doing searches because I don't know the right terms. But as I kind of muddle through looking for things, I go, oh, this is how this is connected with that. And this is how this, and so I'm actually expanding my vocabulary, perish the thought, and also thinking about how different terms are connected. And some of those terms, multiple meanings of words, like, is it record or record? And depending on which word it is, how is it going to be associated in our internet searches with other words? I think that we don't read aloud or read to each other or read for ourselves enough poetry. And poetry is just so rich. Eloise Greenfield, I know my students who are watching, Honey, I Love, that's like my all-time favorite. And there's so much richness of imagery, richness of language, richness of experience that can happen in a poem. And it's not a whole lot of text on a whole lot of pages. And so that's another way of talking to youth and children about books and text and really getting them engaged. And if you have to, okay, you can talk about the rhyming word patterns. All right. We'll give you a little phonics in there. If you can't curb your enthusiasm, then you can always talk about rhyming patterns and words. But there's just so much there to be enjoying. And the other thing I would urge you is to read some young adult books yourselves. They're really interesting. They're really rich. They're a lot of fun. And and if you kind of think about, your own leisure reading, then getting familiar with what's out there for middle grades and young adult books. There's a lot of good choices, as Kim was talking about, and as Liz was talking about, that kind of getting out of our own skin that it has to be on the New York Times bestseller list. Well, let's go to the children's book list and what's out there, and what are they considering, and what issues are they dealing with, and how are they dealing with them, and being able to talk to our students, about these books and about the topics that are represented in the books. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from in terms of this conversation about how do we, there's no place like home, talking to youth and children about books. So Liz and Kim, I want to bring you in and let's have a little conversation before we open it up to, I'm sure, a robust chat, which I know everybody made questions that were 25 words or less with a question mark at the end of it. So if you have to go and revise your questions, you can use this time as we're in conversation. Kim, I thought that you mentioned it well, and Liz, you reinforced it. This whole idea of Black exceptionalism, that the books that we think need to be selected, or the books that might be available, are around, our heroes, around strife, around conflict, around discrimination, around harm. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that. And Liz, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. I'll start. Yeah, again, I think that when we tell these stories and share these stories of Black exceptionalism, we also can sort of narrow down on one story, when instead, like, many of us are collectivists, right? Like, we're all going together. And so I think that kids need to see that story, because otherwise you just think like, oh, this is just one person who did this one thing, instead of there's like lots of processes and people and ways to be involved. And again, there are excellent books that are out there that help us to sort of lead the way. That's what I'm thinking. And then just I want to circle back to something you said, Pam, just about read alouds, right? Scholastic did a study a few years ago, and they, it's a children's study. So they talked to children, and kids who were in 8th grade said the thing that they miss the most is their parents reading to them. So we should be reading to children. We should be reading to them in high school. We should be reading to our grown children. We should just be reading. And I wanted to share that point. But just to talk about, again, I'll circle back to exceptionalism and to think about like the stories that we share. If we must share the exceptional stories, then we should tell the real stories. And I think about Rosa Parks, and we never tell about her work fighting for women, Black women, and justice before she sat down on the bus, right? Like The Dark End of the Street, I think that book is called, is one that is really important and has really has such important context that if we're going to tell, if we insist on telling these stories, then really tell the whole story and tell about all the people that were with these folks, because then it tells the complete story. But, you know, I think there are other stories that we can also tell in the meantime. Liz?
Kim, I'm gonna tell, so I want to jump on the read aloud too. When I was a baby school librarian, and I was working in a K-8 school, and I'm like from my early childhood background, so I'm all songs and puppets and like lap sits and ukuleles and songs, which I do for old people now too. I was having a hard time, believe it or not, in the library with middle schoolers. And it was because I was trying to get them to do things that I thought I should get them to do as an educator / school librarian. And I finally, and in my educator mind at the time, I thought I was like, quote unquote, giving up. And I was like, I'm going to pick out a book and I'm going to read them a chapter book. And it was the most important thing I have done in my professional career, because after I did that, or when I did that, we were all having a experience as a community. We were all able then to relate to certain aspects of this book. We brought ourselves to this book, and then we were able to engage in conversations. And that is actually how I got to know my kids, is reading out loud. And so, yes, read out loud. And read picture books to everybody too, please, for God's sakes. Okay. Black exceptionalism. Like I have my little library crown on. Why are we choosing those stories? Like, why are we choosing those stories to read out loud? And so I guess I'm thinking as a white lady, a lot of times, so I'm going to go back. Let's talk about the story of Rosa Parks. It's very sterilized. It is not nuanced, right? It only allows for one experience. So what is it about that story that makes me comfortable? Like, why did I choose that story to begin with, right? And so I think I always try to think about it as like, oh, this is playing into some larger narrative, right? And centering my comfort in whether it's being exceptional, meritocracy, whatever the mythology of the United States is. There's so much about, you know, Drake started from the bottom, now we're here, but it's a very particular way that Black folks, or folks who aren't white, I have a myriad of ways presented to me of how to get there. But a lot of times when it's not a white character, there is one way. It is through grit. We love to use that word, determination against all the odds, right? So why are we choosing those stories when, as Kim already told us, there are other stories out there?
I think that's important. And I think that whole notion of comfort level, you know, are we picking books to give or to read with the youth in our lives, whether they be in our classrooms or in our homes, you know, and are we picking books that with which we are familiar? And so we're kind of repeating what you were pointing out, Liz, about this, you know, what's out there in the publishing field, and are we just kind of closing that loop and helping it to feed on each other rather than kind of branching out. And I think that that's, you know, back to your quote about the mirrors and the sliding glass doors. You know, when do we help the youth and the children in our lives walk through a sliding glass door, maybe get comfortable with being uncomfortable? And how do you broach that in the library, helping children and teachers expand their notion of a just right book?
Ah, just right books. Sort of the bane of my library existence. They don't exist. All books are just right in the library. And you know, that could also mean, you know, I like to look cool as a kid. I like to tell the story. I really couldn't read till I was 14 and then it clicked for me. But I loved my public library. Mrs. Brown always gave me the space I needed, and I played on the computer and I checked out records. And I liked it was Stephen King's It, which is like 1,200 pages. But how cool did I feel? And actually, my older sibling read the book. But I like felt really proud to carry that book too. And that is okay. So wait, I've told my story is I'm all excited about Stephen King. Dr. Mason, what was the original question?
Was expanding the notion, what is an appropriate just right book? What is a good theme for a particular child? You know, how do you help adults and children get out of the same old in terms of their book selection?
I love this question. And I actually think with kids and with the grown-ups I've worked with, binary thinking is a big, bad beast in our schools and libraries, right? So just right, I guess that means then these other books are not right, right? Like if we can get away with that like false dichotomy around books, that would serve us really, really well. But also for the teachers, especially here today, one book will not do everything. So if you're like, oh, you know, a lot of times I would have teachers be like, Liz, in the library, is there a book about a Japanese American child who's going through a divorce and just got glasses? Literally that specific. And I'm like, no. And what are the themes that we're looking for here? Like, why are you seeking that book out? What is it that you want this child who is going through this particular experience to get from a book? Do you want comfort? Do you want solidarity? Do you like what is it? So sort of thinking more broadly like that. And then also, and I did this with little kids, you know, kindergarten and first grade, when we learned about tropes and stereotypes in our books, we also would say, gosh, this book upholds stereotypes, but it also breaks others. So allowing all of that room in books for ourselves to come to it as educators, as readers, as practitioners, as recommenders, to know that, you know, there is no just right book other than the book that you're reading that you're enjoying. That is the right book for you. At least in the library. You know, I'm not gonna
I hope I agree with you, and I hope that everyone who's participating kind of gets that's
Okay.
the just right book. And I think the other thing that we sometimes don't allow children and youth to do, which we as adults do all the time, is start a book and not finish it. Now, you have to give it some time, you know, like not after the first page, maybe, but you know, there's sometimes you go, yeah, no, sorry, not working for me. And, you know, we're talking about leisure reading, you know, reading that helps us exercise our reading muscles without being so arduous, and, you know, and finding that joy. And if I'm not finding joy in a book, and I belong to 2 book clubs, and there are times when I get like 3/4 of the way and I say, okay, peace out. I'll wait for the discussion, and then sometimes I'll hear the discussion and think, oh, okay, maybe I ought to give it a second chance. Or I'll hear the discussion say, yeah, good, I'm good now. I read my pages, I heard your comments, we're done. So Kim, you want to talk about Just Right Books, and then we'll open it up to our chat.
Sure. I loved what Liz said. And I think what I'm hearing too is that oftentimes, right, the kids who need the most choice and need that freedom to say this book isn't working, don't get it, right? We are often trying to gatekeep around kids of color, kids who are not reading up to grade level. Like those are that's the work that we are always trying to do. We're trying to make their lives worse when really, like, we're giving them the reading logs, we're giving them all of these other things. And I hope that the audience is out here. If you're doing reading logs, please stop. There's no research that says they actually make kids better readers. They actually make kids hate reading. So those are the things, right? These are the practices that we do, that we are thinking about, like the Just Right books and other practices that are not based in research either, that are actually harming kids instead of helping them to become really strong readers. And Dr. Mason, you were talking about sort of the social nature of reading, right? Kids will read if their friends are reading, right? It's just like this. Let's think about our own participation in book clubs. I'm going because my friends are going. I might soldier through this book because someone's going to ask me a question and the snacks are good, right? Like it's these things that we don't afford children, but we just enforce all of these things on them. And I love it how you talked about leisure reading, but my last comment will be about the fact that we drag kids through these classics in school for 6 weeks or a whole quarter, right? Like we're doing harm, when really, if we must teach these books, really no book should be taught more than three weeks. That's it. From soup to nuts, that's it. Like really, let us all make that commitment that we are not going to do any more harm to kids, but we are actually going to support their literacy lives and really, really do that work.
That's great. So Lisa, let us hear some of our well-crafted, short, concise chat questions.
So yeah, this would be the time for folks to submit their questions to the chat or to raise their hands and unmute. We'll call on you and kind of try to go in order so everyone has the opportunity. So yeah, this is your time to ask questions. All right, so we have some coming in. So Caitlin asked, what poetry would you suggest for parents to read aloud to toddlers?
Liz, you want to give that a go?
Any
That was going to be my response.
any poetry. I very quickly have an anecdote about poetry, and I love that you brought poetry up, Dr. Mason, because I remember having to read a Dylan Thomas poem in high school, and I felt shamed for not apparently understanding his message. And it turned me off, of course, from poetry until very recently. And poetry has been one of the most important aspects of my adult literacy life, I'd say, in the last 5 years. So read any poetry to your toddler. What makes you feel good?
Yeah, what's going to make you laugh?
No, go ahead, Dr. Mason.
No, just what's going to make you laugh, and what's, what brings you joy, because it again, we're asking our youth and our children to enjoy reading. So they kind of like, it's like you can't walk the talk without talking the talk. So let's do a little bit of both.
Absolutely. So Amalia asked, oh, just disappeared here. Here we go. So in contexts that are more conservative and restrictive with the kinds of literature that is available or deemed valuable, what are implicit or subtle ways in which we could still expose children to differing perspectives within a mandated curriculum?
Well, I would say that you can always talk back to the text. So here's the text I'm required to teach. And then as Liz and both Kim were talking about, like, then raise the criticality. You know, what voices aren't being heard? How does this resonate or not with your experience? How would you have handled that experience differently? And so you are teaching the text, but you're allowing the learners and the readers to have agency around the text. Kim, Liz?
No, I agree. I think that that's great. Dr. Basin, I like that. I co-sign.
I in my library program, and I think this speaks to it, I had a giant whiteboard when I was an elementary school librarian. It was like the whiteboard paint, and there were 4 questions. Who tells the stories? Who's missing from the stories? Who benefits from the stories? And then I think one of the most important questions that that's not always asked is why. So like you just said, is you can teach that text. And then in the same way, I taught kindergartners and first graders to recognize stereotypes, tropes, narratives with those words too, right? These kids are brilliant. They know what's up. They'll be like, oh, why? Well, let them, unpacking why is really generative and rich. And again, I understand I'm living and working in New England, where we do have these problems. I don't want to say they don't exist. They absolutely do, but not at the same levels in other places in the country.
So Kim, I have a question here for you from Katie. She asked, can you talk more about only reading, aka dragging kids through a book for 3 weeks? She says, I think many English teachers are worried that kids won't get everything they were supposed to get in that time.
I love that. Hey, Katie. I think that, as Liz said, like one book can't be everything to everybody. And I know English teacher right here, we love our text, but you have to actually think about like what do we want this unit to do? And also, what's the most important thing to get out of this book, right? We have other books that we're teaching. We insist on teaching core text, which, like that's what it is. But also, what are the other opportunities to have kids to experience whatever it is we want? I mean, I think that when I know plenty of kids who have been dragged through the Odyssey in the fall quarter, right? The whole thing, they go on their own Odyssey because it's so long, right? And they hate it. And so, like, really, we don't have to teach all the books. English teachers, we love our books, but also you can just teach 9 through 12 or whatever those ones are. And keep it moving, because ultimately that's going to come back again, right? Like, think about it. Like, do you want them to understand the hero's journey? It's everywhere. There are other books to teach it. And so it's the discipline to think, okay, I'm going to get the most important things out of this. I'm going to help them to understand these things and to sort of set the foundation to move on, to strengthen it and deepen it later, right? We shouldn't be teaching books for longer than 3 weeks. I mean, that's what I think. It's fine. I've done it. And I love my books. I also have been on the other side of trying to drag kids through the Odyssey for a quarter, right? I've been in school districts where that happened. And what I know is that kids don't read it, right? We should also like really be honest. Kids aren't reading these books. There are so many digital ways that they can not read it, that's how they're going to spend their time. Like, what do we really want them to understand? And really like be honest with ourselves, be honest with the kids, do the kids a favor, let them read other things, and then just, like help them to have a really successful experience while they're with us. I don't want to be remembered as a teacher who killed reading for them. I don't. And plenty of us have that moniker. I'm just not trying. I'm not interested in doing that for them.
Can I give a quick shout out to Katie, who was my principal that allowed me to become, who asked this question, who allowed me to be the librarian I am. And so who is an alum, so if any of y'all are learning to be principals, please talk to this person. And thank you, Katie.
Love that. So Manar asked, I firmly believe in the importance of joy and forming a joyful bond with books to love reading. Are there any studies I should read supporting this notion of joy?
Golden Muhammad writes a lot about joy. I would say to start with her, cultivating joy, all of her stuff, and then that will give you a good solid foundation of what it is. And also to think about like, what are all the ways that resistance is a form of joy, and where are those examples in literature, right? Everyday literature. And how can you sort of also layer that onto the research and have this really interesting conversation.
And I don't know if you saw, would you mind putting that name, the author's name in the chat? Thank you. Any other questions as we head into our final few minutes? Thank you, Kim.
Well, as we don't seem to have any questions, Liz, final thoughts, Kim, final thoughts, and then Lisa will close us out.
Thank you. Please, please make sure you have a school library. We are not guaranteed, Massachusetts especially. I'm not the head of Boston Public Libraries, thank God. That's a bigger job. I'm the director of Boston Public School Libraries. We have under half of our schools have school libraries. School libraries are of particular importance in having books, being able to access those books for pleasure reading outside of the curriculum, and also spaces that provide kids some sort of agency within their day and room for criticality. And so please, 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 and if you contact me, you want to know what school libraries can do, please ask. They can do a lot, and make sure if you are an educator, please be working with your school librarian. And also thank you, Dr. Mason and Dr. Parker. As always, what a joy. And all of you for coming here, obviously, and your lovely faces.
Kim?
Yes, appreciations for everyone that is here. Thank you, Dr. Mason, for bringing us together. It's always a joy. A couple of things I will say. It's really important for us as human beings to read widely and wisely, particularly in areas that we might not like, right? Like that's how we figure out, right, where our reading biases are, and then can do something about them. And also, I'm going to encourage all of us to continue to be gate openers for kids, particularly for kids who have not had robust literacy lives. We know that those are often Black, Brown, and other kids who deserve it the most. And I really think by any means necessary, it's our job to make sure that kids have robust literacy lives, and we are the ones to do it. So let us do it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Liz and Kim for joining me on this conversation. And again, my admonition is joy in reading, and just let it go. If they're reading, as you know, they'll read more and they'll get better at it. So Lisa, you want to do the last minute housekeeping?
Absolutely. Pamela, Liz, Kim, thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. And thank you to our audience for being here today. So yes, next week we will be sending out a follow-up email with the session recording and other resources. So please look out for that. And otherwise, I hope that all of you have a great rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you.